Professor, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to talk about your background a bit. Your dad was a postal worker, your mom was a teacher, right? That's as nice as it can get. You had indicated in the past, you'd written in the past about how race was a staple among family discussions in your family. How did that impact, you think, your life, your career?
Well, I think it's had a huge impact on my life. I mean, for one thing, um, race had a lot to do with where I grew up. My my parents met and married in South Carolina. Question, why didn't I grow up in South Carolina? I did not grow up in South Carolina because my parents were refugees from the Jim Crow South. I once asked my father, Dad, why did you move? Because I had heard that my parents had just built a house. And my father says to me, we moved because if we didn't move, one of two things was going to happen. Either a white man was going to kill me or I was going to kill a white man. That's how raw, that's how violent, that's how pervasive racial conflict was. That's how dangerous it was. And to protect their children, my parents moved to Washington, D.C., which is where I grew up, though I went back to South Carolina quite a lot.
Justice Thurgood Marshall is one of the most important figures in American history for everybody. He may be even more important to you. I'd like to talk to you about your clerkship for Justice Marshall.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about what that experience was like. And to the extent that folks don't know who you are at cocktail parties, that might be a nice point of introduction.
Well, Justice Marshall has been very important in my life. When I was a kid, I used to hear that name all the time because in 1948, my father in Columbia, South Carolina, went to hear Thurgood Marshall, the main lawyer for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. My father went to hear Thurgood Marshall argue a case. The name of the case was Rice versus Elmore. Prior to 1948, Black people in South Carolina were not permitted to participate in the Democratic Party's primary for elections. Now, this was a very consequential disability because anybody who won statewide office in South Carolina was a Democrat. And so if you couldn't participate in the Democratic Party, primary, you were essentially disenfranchised. Well, my father knew Mr. Elmore and went to see the argument, and for the rest of his life talked about what an inspiring thing it was to see Thurgood Marshall argue that case. He prevailed, by the way. This was one of the last of the white primary cases. In any event, so I heard about Thurgood Marshall when I was growing up, and then I went to law school. I went to Yale Law School. I clerked for a judge at the Court of Appeals, a wonderful judge, J. Skelly Wright. And then I clerked for Thurgood Marshall at the Supreme Court. I was one of 4 law clerks. I clerked for Justice Marshall in the 1983 Supreme Court term. And so for a solid year, I had the distinct privilege of being able to talk with Mr. Civil Rights, 4 or 5 times a week. Every day when I go to the Supreme Court, I'd see Thurgood Marshall and would often talk with Thurgood Marshall and talk for hours with Thurgood Marshall. And so he was very important to me. He's a person who I revere. I think there's a good argument that Thurgood Marshall is the greatest lawyer in the history of the United States. And so, yes, he has definitely influenced my career.
Do you think his biggest achievement was something that he did on the court, or was it something prior to then for the NAACP or something else?
You know, good question. I think Thurgood Marshall, this shows the greatness of Thurgood Marshall. Because Thurgood Marshall actually, his greatest achievement was before he became a justice. You know, with most people who become justices of the Supreme Court, frankly, if they had not become justices, we wouldn't be talking about them. We would not even know about them. That's the case with 90% or more of the people on the Supreme Court, you know, perfectly fine lawyers, but you wouldn't be talking about them. Their claim to fame is that, you know, they lucked out and a president nominated them, and they got the Senate to confirm them, and then they go on the Supreme Court and they become big shots. Well, Thurgood Marshall was a big shot before he got to the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall was the leading lawyer for the NAACP. He was the leading appellate lawyer. When I say appellate lawyer, he was the leading lawyer arguing in courts of appeal and arguing in cases before the Supreme Court in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s in civil rights cases. He argued scores of landmark civil rights cases. To show you how important and to show you what a great career Thurgood Marshall had, I was at his house once. He was having a cookout for his law clerks. And I'm in his basement. He had a house in Virginia. I'm in his basement, and I'm looking at his bookshelf. And on his bookshelf were bound volumes that contain the briefs in cases he had argued at the Supreme Court. And I'm down there, and he comes in, and I turn to him and I say, "Well, Justice Marshall, which case are you most proud of that you participated in?" And frankly, I thought for sure he was going to say Brown versus Board of Education. That's his most famous case, right? Brown versus Board of Education. He surprised me. He said, "Oh, the case that I'm most proud of in terms of my performance as an appellate attorney was Smith versus Allwright, a 1944 case involving the Texas white primary." Now, I mean, a lot of people don't even know about Smith versus Allwright, but for him, that was the case about, you know, that's the case regarding which he's most proud. And, you know, Brown versus Board of Education takes a back seat to that case. Well, good grief. You know, any lawyer would be happy to have participated in any of those cases. He participated in scores.
I'd like to talk to you about academia for a bit. You taught at Harvard for, I think, 40 years this year. What changes have you seen in your time at Harvard over the past decades?
Yeah, I've taught at Harvard Law School since the summer of 1984. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. Harvard Law School has been a wonderful place in which to teach and to create legal scholarship. I have wonderful colleagues. I have smart, ambitious, hardworking students. It's a wonderful place if you want to be a legal academic. What changes have I seen? Well, there have been some. I mean, Harvard Law School is a big law school. It's one of the biggest law schools in the country. And so one thing that Harvard has done, it's tried to make itself more welcoming to people who might be intimidated by a big law school. So for instance, when I started Harvard Law School in the first year class, which I think has maybe 600 students, the first year class was divided into 4 big sections. Well, the authorities at Harvard Law School thought it would be better for students to be in smaller sections. So now we have 7 sections instead of 4. that took a lot of that we had to hire a lot more people to make that possible. It was a very expensive proposition, but it has made the law school, I think, a cozier place, a place where students get to know their professors better, and that starts in the first year. So that's one of the changes. There have been other changes. There are a lot more women on the faculty than when I began. When I began in summer of 1984, I think that there were maybe there were maybe there were five, probably fewer, but let's say there were five. Now they're that double that easily. There are more people of color that are on the faculty. I think that the ideological range on the faculty is quite broad. There's Harvard Law School, like I said, it's a big place. Sometimes it is said at elite law schools, they tend to go liberal, and Harvard Law School too. But Harvard Law School also has a substantial cadre of conservative professors, conservatives of various flavors. Harvard Law School also has people who are quite progressive, self-consciously to the left. So there's a wide ideological range at Harvard Law School, and again, that's one of its attractions. So, it's changed in various ways. One thing that has been a constant in my work life, it has always been very supportive. It has facilitated my work, and I'm very grateful for that.
Right. You touched upon it, right? The narrative sometimes out there is that some of these universities, high-level universities, liberal colleges, effectively employ left-leaning professors that then make it a mission to indoctrinate kids and so on and so forth. In your experience, and you would know better than me, you would obviously know better than most, is that something that you've seen?
Well, I think that can be a problem in some places. So, some of the complaints about colleges and universities being bubbles where there is too little frank, candid, ideological contestation, where there's too little ideological diversity. Yeah, it seems to me, and I'm a person on the left, by the way. I think that is a real complaint, and a justified complaint for some places. I do not think that is a well-taken complaint at Harvard Law School. Again, there's a wide ideological spectrum. There is people of all sorts have their say. There is debate. There is open debate. There is quite sharp debate. So I feel like I've been lucky, but is that a problem in some places? Yeah, I've seen that. Sure, that's a problem in some places.
You obviously been a witness to what's been going on American campuses, college campuses over the past several months. It's chaotic to say the least, and there are a million ways in which we can take this discussion, whether it's a discussion about the First Amendment, college administration, so on and so forth. Big picture, what do you see? What's your opinion? What's your view on what's going on these days?
Well, like you say, there are a lot of things that are going on. This has been a remarkable school year, and a lot that is bad has happened. And I would say, of the bad things that have happened, the thing to me that's the most worrying to me is the interference in higher education by the Congress of the United States. The committee that is headed by, I think her name is Virginia Fox, the House of Representatives, and others in this particular committee that have summoned presidents of universities to come speak. This is very worrying. For one thing, this committee, this congressional committee, is not truly engaged in an investigation. If you're engaged in an investigation, you want to know, well, what's going on, and you bring people and you say, okay, well, I have lots of questions for you. I have lots of questions for you. That's not what's going on. This committee has conclusions. It has determined, for instance, that rampant anti-Semitism is a huge problem at Harvard University. It concluded that, and then it summoned the president of Harvard University to the Congress so that they could berate the president, they could humiliate the president, they could attempt to intimidate the former president of Harvard University, Claudine Gay. They did succeed in humiliating, they did succeed in intimidating her, as she's no longer president of Harvard University. They succeeded in ousting her. They succeeded in ousting the former president of the University of Pennsylvania. I think that this is a very bad thing when you have the people in Congress who seek to use their investigatory power to harass authorities at institutions of higher education and attempt to, change what they are doing in terms of their curricula, in terms of their hiring, in terms of the scholarly environment. I think for me, that has been the most worrying development of the past year.
Now, the argument that is attempted to counter that argument, right, is that there's a double standard, right? When you have Jewish anti-rhetoric, when you have anti-Semitism on campus, that seems to be speech that is freer, let's say, than if you had hateful speech directed at other groups. What's your point to counter that?
I think that there has been a double standard. I'm not going to say that the universities are blameless. I think that there are criticisms to be made of the universities, and this is one. In fact, with respect to the critique of the university, I think, at least among faculty members, the thing that I think has gotten the most traction is the allegation that university authorities have acted according to a double standard. They have shown racial minority, Blacks and Latinos, but particularly Blacks, more solicitude than other people, for instance, Jews. The claim is that, well, gosh, in the George Floyd moment, there were people who were called on the carpet or disciplined when students complained about various things. So, for instance, if a professor was in a class and asked a student to read from a book or read from a court opinion, and the court opinion contained the word, or the court opinion, contained the word, and the student was asked to read this, the student read this out loud, there would be students who would complain. There were professors who were disciplined because of this. Well, frankly, but more recently, people say, well, gosh, you have students who were saying things which are anti-Semitic and they're not being disciplined, what gives here? So I think that there has been a double standard, and that needs to be attended to. Now, in attending to that, we have a complication because, how do you iron out, how do you make something uniform so you don't have a double standard? One way of doing that would be to say, okay, let's act in the same way that we did a few years ago. Let's discipline more professors who do things which outrage some students. You could do that. Or another thing you could do is say, you know what? There has been a double standard. We're going to cut that double standard. And by the way, it was bad a couple of years ago when teachers were disciplined for reading some book and the book had the word in it. First of all, there's nothing wrong with the word. My former boss, the great Thurgood Marshall, used the word. So did Martin Luther King Jr., so did A. Philip Randolph, so did John Lewis, so have a lot of great people. There was censoriousness, there was sort of this, people going around with their chin stuck out, waiting to be offended. There was a bunch of that stuff not good. And we are going to repudiate that in our way of responding to that. And going forward, we are going to be more attentive to the requirements of freedom in general and academic freedom in particular. And if that, part of freedom means opening yourself up to things which you might find quite disturbing. That's freedom. And so going forward, we are going to insist, especially in higher education. We're not talking, we're not talking about third grade here. We're not talking about kindergarten. We're not talking about third grade. We are talking about higher education. And with respect to higher education, we're talking about people who should be mature enough to make distinctions, mature enough to have thick skins, and understand that education will have some pains from time to time associated with it. And so going forward, we're going to give a lot of leeway to freedom, academic freedom included, even if that involves putting up with obnoxious speech, obnoxious ideas, even if it means that. That's some of what I would say.
The problem, it seems to me, is that obviously, particularly when you're dealing with private institutions, they aren't subject to constitutional muster, right? So now you're at the mercy of the criminal law, which obviously criminalizes certain behavior, including behavior on campus, and you're relegated to the procedures and practices of each individual school. And then it looks like there may be some room for selective enforcement, and that's when people seem to have a problem.
Couple things. Number one, so for instance, my institution, Harvard University, is a private institution, and you're absolutely right. Therefore, it is not directly governed by the First Amendment. But Harvard University, along with many private universities, have put themselves under the First Amendment voluntarily. They have said, we are going to act as if the First Amendment directly governed us. Now, I think by the way, it's a good thing that in the United States, huge country, 300 million people. I think it's a good thing that we have public institutions and private institutions. I think it's a good thing if private institutions want to act in a different way than public institutions. You know, we're a big country, let 1,000 flowers bloom. If you have a private institution, let's suppose you have a private institution and you say up front, we are not going to abide the voicing of certain ideas. You know, we just want to let you know that up front. There's certain language, there's certain ideas that are not, we're not going to even allow them to be voiced on this campus. As far as I'm concerned, that's okay. You don't have to be a student there. You don't have to go there. If you're a faculty member, you don't have to get employment there. Let them do their thing. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. And, you know, that's, again, that comes, you know, that's part of the cost of pluralism. I'm okay with that.
I want to talk to you a bit about DEI. You had written an article for the Harvard Crimson about the dangers of DEI. Tell me about some of those.
Two things. Number one, I think that the diversity, equity, and inclusion apparatus, bureaucracy, movement, you know, it came from a good aspiration. You know, what was its aspiration? The aspiration was to make institutions welcoming to people who, for various reasons, maybe gender, maybe race, maybe sexual preference, you know, for all sorts of reasons, various groups of people had been marginalized, had been made to feel unwelcome. And this was an effort on the part of these institutions to say, we want you, we welcome you, we want to encourage you, we want to facilitate your participation in our community. That's a perfectly fine, good, decent impulse. That's point one, number one. Point number two, the problem is that even when people start off with good aspirations, it's very easy for people to, you know, go down the wrong road, especially with respect to bureaucracies. You know, as soon as people get some power, I don't care who it is. I don't care who it is. As soon as anybody gets some power, you know, what did Lord Acton say? Power corrupts. It goes to people's heads. And so what happened with DEI is, you know, the DEI people got a little bit of power at these various institutions, mine included. They got a bit of power. They had an aspiration that they, you know, really believed in. They really wanted to make, you know, all sorts of people welcome. And they then start, you know, sort of pushing people to embrace their beliefs. So if, you know, there's certain language we don't want you to use. Now that's an aspiration. They have their idea about, you know, certain language they don't want you to use, but they get a little bit of power. And then they say, well, we're not just going to try to persuade you not to say this. We're going to tell you that if you say this, you're now in trouble. Now, the thing about DEI that really gets me the most and that prompted the article to which you alluded was at many universities now, if you want a position, if you want to get a position as an entry-level professor, or if you want a promotion, let's suppose you're a, you know, a tenured, you know, professor, but you want to, you know, get more money, you want to get promoted. At a lot of universities, they require you to submit a DEI statement. What do I mean by that? I mean a statement in which you say that you tell the authorities, you tell the people that you're trying to impress, how you plan to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in your teaching and in your scholarship. Now, again, remember what I said a few minutes ago. I'm very sympathetic to the DEI aspiration. But I don't want anybody telling people who want to go into academia, you must think this or you must think that. I mean, what about, imagine somebody who actually doesn't like DEI. They don't like it. They think it was a mistake to go that route. They want to be a professor. They want to be a professor of physics or chemistry or English or something. And they say straight out, actually, you've asked me for a DEI statement. I don't believe in that. Well, we know for certain, a lot of places, you could be Einstein, but if you say that, they're going to crumple up your application immediately and into the trash can it goes. Well, I think that is an encroachment on academic freedom. I think that is coercion. It's coercion with a velvet glove. They don't say outright, think this or else, but that's actually what's going on. And I think that's a real danger. If I was applying for a faculty position today, I think that I would have a lot of problems. I think at many institutions, I think there'd be many institutions at which, my application would go in the waste paper basket very quickly because I would be skeptical of this DEI mandatory statement. And again, I don't want to be enlisted in any political program. I don't want to make any pledge of allegiance. And let me just say one last thing on this. This is something I've said to friends who disagree with me about this. I talk with them and I say, listen, what would you say? What would you say if a university said, confronted a person who wanted to, be a member of the faculty? Imagine a university saying, we want to know before we hire you, or before we consider you, we want to know your plans for making America great again in terms of your teaching, in terms of your scholarship. How do you plan to make America great? We would howl. We would say, oh no, you can't say that. You can't demand that. Well, you see where I'm coming from. You see where I'm going on this.
Isn't it ironic? You mentioned a second ago that if you had to apply these days, you don't know how successful you'd be. Isn't it ironic that a law professor who had clerked for Thurgood Marshall wouldn't be able to get a job based on DEI standards?
It is, and again, it is, and that's one of the problems we have in academia. Again, I think that there's a lot of wonderful things going on in our colleges and universities. Our colleges and universities are full of hardworking, smart, well-intended students and teachers. I do not want to, give a blanket condemnation of higher education. There's a lot of good stuff going on there, but there are things that are real problems, and this is one of them. And you put your finger on a real, what you said is, that's a real irony, and it's a dark irony, and it is profoundly troubling. And that needs to be straightened out.
Professor, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you. I know your time is valuable. and I appreciate it very, very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. Be well.